This is the story of Daniel Etchworth and his wife, Predictable. They had built a life that looked from the outside like the kind most people quietly envied. A house with a garden that Priya had planted herself, 2 salaries that crossed comfortably into comfort, and 11 years of marriage that had survived the ordinary erosions of time. What no one saw, because neither of them spoke it aloud, was that Daniel had been grieving something for nearly 2 years. Not a person, not a loss anyone could name, but a version of his marriage he had slowly stopped believing would return. He had not stopped loving Priya. That was the complicated truth he carried alone. He had simply stopped feeling like she needed him to, and Priya, for her part, had grown so accustomed to Daniel's steadiness that she had long since stopped noticing it. The way we stop noticing the weight of a coat we've worn for years, only feeling it the moment it's gone. The Saturday routine had not changed in 4 years. Daniel made coffee at 7:15, 2 cups, both with a half spoon of sugar, because Priya had once told him she was cutting back, and he'd simply continued making it that way, without ever asking whether she still wanted to. He would leave hers on the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl, and by the time she came downstairs, hair still pinned from sleep, wearing the oversized university hoodie she'd owned since before they'd met, it would be exactly the right temperature. She would say thank you in the absent way people say it when they mean nothing cruel by the absence. She would open her phone. He would open his book. They would sit at the same table and occupy entirely separate silences, and this somehow had become intimacy. They were not unhappy in any loud, obvious way. That was what made it so difficult. Daniel was 41. A structural engineer who spent his days thinking about load-bearing walls and the invisible stresses that buildings absorbed without showing cracks. He had a dry sense of humor, a habit of finishing other people's crossword clues in his head without saying them out loud, and a particular discomfort with confrontation that he had spent years mistaking for patience. He was the kind of man who noticed when a conversation was going wrong and chose to redirect it rather than address it. A quality that had once felt to Priya like emotional maturity and had lately begun to feel like a wall. Priya was 38, a marketing director at a mid-sized agency, sharp and funny in social settings in the way that requires enormous energy to maintain. She was the person at every dinner who made the table laugh, who remembered birthdays and wine preferences, and which couples were going through difficult patches. She was generous with her attention when she wanted to be. The trouble was that for a long time now, the generosity had mostly flowed outward, to colleagues, to friends, to her sister's children, and by the time she came home, she had very little of it left. She did not think of this as a problem. She thought of it as being tired. Daniel had, over the past year and a half, begun to notice the specific shape of her tiredness, how it never seemed to apply on the evenings she was seeing friends, how she was never too tired to spend an hour on the phone with her colleague Neil, laughing at something she wouldn't explain when Daniel asked, just, "Oh, nothing, work stuff." He had noticed and he had not asked, and the not asking had calcified into something he was afraid to examine too closely. Neil Sharma had joined Priya's agency 14 months ago. Daniel had met him twice, once at Priya's office holiday party, once when Neil and a few colleagues had come over for a Sunday lunch that Priya had organized without mentioning to Daniel until the Thursday before. Neil was easy to be around, the kind of person who asked questions and actually listened, who touched your arm lightly when making a point. Daniel had liked him, which made the unformed suspicion sitting in his chest feel both worse and somehow self-accusatory, as though his discomfort were the problem rather than the symptom. He had told himself many times that he was being paranoid, that a marriage did not become this fragile without his having contributed to it, that Priya's increasing distance was something they could still address if he could only find the right moment, the right words, the right version of himself that felt worthy of asking for more. He had been waiting for that moment for 9 months. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Priya came home carrying leftover birthday cake from someone's office celebration in a cardboard box, and she put it on the counter and said, "There's chocolate inside if you want it." And Daniel looked at her from across the kitchen and thought, "I miss you," and said nothing. She opened her phone. He put the kettle on. The garden outside had gone dark. November arrived the way it always did, gray and unhurried, pressing the light out of the evenings earlier each day. Daniel had started keeping a list. Not a dramatic list, not an accusation, just a quiet, private catalog of the things he had noticed and set aside, all those small moments he'd convinced himself were unimportant. He kept it in the Notes app on his phone under a title that said, Project Midlands, a real project, a genuine one, but also a container for everything he couldn't say aloud. He would add to it occasionally, not with anger, but with the careful precision of someone documenting a slow leak. October 14. Phoned face down at dinner. First time she's done that in months. Oct 21. Home 40 minutes later than expected. Didn't mention where. No 3. Laughed at something on her screen. Turned it away when I looked up. He was not a suspicious man by nature. He had been, before Daniel, in a relationship with someone who had genuinely deceived him, and he had promised himself afterward that he would not become the kind of person who interpreted everything through the lens of anticipated betrayal. So he had given Priya the benefit of doubt, again and again, a coin he had flipped so many times it no longer felt like generosity but like a reflex. The dinners with friends had become the axis around which everything else turned. They had a loose group, 4 couples who had known each other in various configurations for the better part of a decade, Simone and Patrick, who had the kind of bickering marriage that functioned as everyone's background entertainment, Divya and Tom, whose 2 young children meant they arrived tired and left early, and Reena, Priya's closest friend who had been divorced for 3 years and whose social energy arrived in concentrated theatrical doses. It was at Reena's house, on a Friday evening in mid-November, that Daniel first felt the ground shift beneath him in a way he could not rationalize. Priya had been animated all evening in a way she rarely was at home, bright-eyed, quick laughing, leaning forward over her wine with the physical warmth she used to turn toward him. They were talking about someone's renovation, then about someone's job change, and then Reena said something about men who couldn't remember anniversaries, and the conversation tilted, as it sometimes did in groups like this, into the comfortable territory of spouse complaints. It was Simone who started it, rolling her eyes at Patrick over the risotto thing again, the same risotto story that had been told at least 4 times. Then Divya mentioned Tom's inability to buy a birthday present that didn't come from the petrol station. And then, on the back of a laugh that was already in the room, Priya said, I keep telling Daniel, one of these days I'm going to trade him in for a better model, something with a personality setting, you know. Press a button and it actually asks how your day was. The table laughed. It was a light joke, a familiar kind of marital comedy shorthand, and it landed without much weight. Daniel smiled. He had heard variations of this joke before, had even played along once or twice, performing the self-deprecating response that the genre required. But something in this one was different, and he felt it in the specific place where tone lives, below the words. The laugh she gave when she said it wasn't for the room, it was for herself. He looked at her, and she wasn't looking back. She was grinning at her wine glass. In the car going home, they talked about nothing consequential. Priya said she was tired. He said yes, him too. The streetlights moved across her face in the passenger seat, and he watched the road and thought about load-bearing walls, and how you could not always tell from the outside how much stress a structure had already absorbed. He opened his Notes app that night before sleeping. No 14, something has shifted. I don't think this is fixable. He stared at the sentence for a long time, then he closed the app, turned out the light, and lay very still while Priya slept beside him with her back to him, and the house settled quietly in the dark, making all its ordinary sounds. He had made a decision or something close to one. He had not yet allowed himself to name it. The December dinner was Simone and Patrick's idea, a pre-Christmas gathering, the same 8 people, a bigger table. Daniel almost said he had a work conflict. He had drafted the excuse twice on his phone and deleted it both times because some part of him, the part that was still hoping, still watching for the version of Priya that might return to him, thought perhaps it would be different this time. Perhaps the last few weeks had been a bad stretch. Perhaps they could sit across from each other tonight and feel, even briefly, like they were on the same side of something. He cooked that afternoon, a lamb dish that took 3 hours, and Priya came into the kitchen around 4 o'clock smelling of perfume she had reapplied after her shower, which she didn't usually do for Simone and Patrick's, and she looked at what he was making and said, "Oh, that smells amazing," and there was a moment, brief, warm, confusing, where she stood beside him and her shoulder was touching his, and it felt like something it had stopped feeling like for a long time. Then her phone buzzed and she moved away. The dinner was the kind of evening that expanded easily to fit whatever energy people brought. Simone had made too much food. Patrick had bought too much wine. Rena was in high form, performing an extended story about a disastrous hinge date that had the whole table in tears. Tom had not, this time, brought a petrol station gift. Divya looked genuinely rested for the first time in months. Daniel drank his wine slowly and watched his wife. She was radiant in the way she sometimes still was in rooms full of people. Electric and quick and magnetic. She was telling a story about a campaign pitch that had gone sideways, and people were leaning toward her, and she had that quality she possessed when she was completely herself. The room organized itself around her without her asking it to. He had fallen in love with her, partly for exactly this quality, and he sat there now, holding his wine glass, and found that it was possible to love someone completely, and also know that you needed to stop. The conversation turned inevitably to the familiar territory. It started with Rena, as it often did. Rena was talking about someone she was seeing, cautiously, ambiguously, and this opened the floor to the usual gentle interrogation. Then Simone said something about what made a good partner, and Patrick said someone with a functioning internal monologue, which got a laugh. And the thread unraveled loosely from there. Priya had had perhaps 1 glass more than usual. She said it looking at the table, not at Daniel, with the particular looseness of someone who has stopped calculating. "Honestly, I think I deserve an upgrade at this point. A better husband. Something more. I don't know, emotionally available. Present. You know what I mean." She was laughing when she said it. The table responded with the low, uncertain laughter of people who are not quite sure how to read the room. Daniel set down his glass. He was quiet for a moment, not dramatically, not pausing for effect. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he had thought about something for a very long time. He said, "If you really believe that, I'll make it easy for you." His voice was level. He was not performing coldness. He was simply not performing warmth he didn't feel. The table went very still. Priya looked at him, and in her face, he saw it, and he would think about it for a long time afterward. Was not hurt, not yet, but the expression of someone who had made a joke expecting a particular response and had received instead something true. He did not say anything else. He picked up his wine again, and Simone started talking about dessert, and the moment passed into the evening, because that is what moments do. But Daniel had said it, and he had meant it, and Priya, who was very good at reading people in rooms, understood that. On the drive home, she said, "That was uncalled for." He said, "I know." She said, "I was joking." He said, "I know." She waited. He did not add anything. They pulled into the driveway, and he sat for a moment with the engine off and the darkness of the garden through the windscreen, and she got out, and he sat there alone in the car for a few more minutes before he followed her inside. He moved systematically. That was the thing Priya could not, in the weeks that followed, fully absorb, the absence of drama. She had expected, after the night of the dinner, a conversation, a real one, the kind they'd been skirting for months. Accusations and confessions and the mutual excavation of grievance that would at least produce something clear. She had prepared herself for it, rehearsed the shape of what she might say, the defenses and the counter-accusations, the way she would explain, without quite saying it, that the distance between them had not been unilateral. What she got instead was Daniel. He was not cold to her, not noticeably. He continued to make coffee. He continued to ask in the morning whether she wanted anything from the shop. He came home at the usual time, cooked on the evenings it was his turn. sat beside her on the sofa watching the same programs. He was present in every logistical sense, but there was something in his presence that had changed, a quality of attention she could not identify until she understood, slowly, that what was missing was hope. He had stopped reaching toward her, not visibly, not dramatically, but in all the small, internal ways that reach before the gesture does. In the second week of January, he told her he had been to see a solicitor. He was not dramatic about this. They were in the kitchen. He was washing up. He said it the way he might have said he'd had a difficult meeting, factual and without embellishment, and Priya stood very still on the other side of the counter and heard herself say what? He explained, quietly, that he had separated their joint account the previous November, that he had spoken with HR about the pension, that he had been looking since September at rental properties, not urgently, not as a decision made, but as a preparation. A door held open while he waited to see whether anything would change. September. She did the calculation automatically, helplessly. September was 3 months before the dinner. The dinner she had thought had started something. The dinner that had, in fact, ended it. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He turned off the tap and dried his hands. "I kept thinking I would," he said. "I kept thinking we'd find the right time." She said, "And Neil?" She hadn't planned to say it. It came out with the bluntness of something that has been held too long. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking about Neil," he said. "That's not really what this is about." She wanted him to ask. She understood this afterward. Sitting alone in the bedroom for a long time, she had wanted him to be angry about Neil, because anger would have been a claim on her, evidence of feeling, something she could push against. His refusal to make it about that, the quiet, resolute focusing of his grief on the broader erosion of the marriage, rather than on any single betrayal, was harder to bear than accusation. He moved out in February. A flat 20 minutes away, small, with a desk under the window where he could work in the evenings. He did not, as she had expected, take very much. She found herself walking from room to room some evenings in the way that people do when they are looking for something they cannot name. The garden had needed attention for months, and she did not tend it, partly because she did not know how. She had planted it knowing Daniel would maintain it. She had not thought about what would happen to it if he stopped. Rena came over with wine on a Thursday evening in March and let Priya talk for 2 hours without interrupting except to refill her glass. And at some point Priya heard herself saying, "I just thought he would always be there." And the sentence sat between them like something that had taken too long to say. "They always are," said Rena carefully, "until they're not." It was not wisdom she had asked for. It lodged in her anyway. She had begun, in the slow, painful way of someone whose defenses are still largely intact, to understand the shape of what she had done. Not the dinner, not the joke, but the long accumulating pattern the joke had simply made visible. She had treated Daniel's steadiness as a resource rather than a gift. She had confused his patience with an absence of need. She had turned toward the shining newness of being wanted by someone else and called it nothing. Told herself it was nothing, for long enough that it had quietly become something she'd have to live with. She called him once, in March, and he answered. And they talked for 20 minutes in the careful way of people who have known each other very well and are now practicing being strangers. She said, "I'm sorry, Daniel." He said, "I know you are." And then there was a silence that neither of them rushed to fill. They met to sign some paperwork in early May, at a solicitor's office that smelled of carpet and the particular institutional calm of rooms where endings are processed. Priya had not slept well. She had dressed with care, not for him exactly, but not for him either, which was one of several things she had been noticing about herself lately. She arrived 5 minutes early and sat in the waiting room reading the same paragraph of a magazine article 4 times without absorbing it. Daniel arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. He was wearing the gray jacket she had bought him 2 Christmases ago, the one she'd handed to him across the table, and said, "I think this will suit you." And he had smiled and put it on, and it had suited him. She did not know why he would wear it today. She did not know whether it meant anything or nothing. He sat down across from her. The solicitor's assistant brought water in plastic cups. He said hello and she said hello, and they were 58 minutes inside a building together while their marriage was formally concluded. Afterward, they stood on the pavement outside. The day was one of those clear May days that feel like an argument for continuing to exist. Bright and mild, the trees on the street still in that first extravagant greenness of new leaves. A woman pushed a pram past them. A man on a bicycle rang his bell without slowing down. Priya said, "How are you?" Daniel considered the question the way he always had, not deflecting but genuinely thinking before answering. "I'm okay," he said. "I think I'm okay." She nodded. She had questions she had been preparing for months, in all their variations. Whether he had regretted waiting so long, whether the dinner had really been the moment or just the occasion, whether anything she might have said or done in those final weeks would have changed his course. She had arranged these questions in order of urgency, had rehearsed the way she would ask them without seeming to need the answers too much. She did not ask any of them, because standing here on this ordinary street with the paperwork signed and the formalities concluded, she understood that the answers belonged to a version of their relationship that no longer existed, that what she was looking for, the clear reckoning, the single explanation, the something that would make it all cohere into a story she could tell herself and others, was not available. A marriage did not end in a moment. Not even in a joke made in a room full of people. Not even in a cold and truthful reply. It ended in all the mornings he had made coffee. She hadn't really tasted. In all the evenings she had chosen her phone over his presence. In the long, slow process of two people growing not apart exactly, but inward, into themselves, away from each other, the gap widening so gradually that neither of them had named it until naming was all that was left. She said, "Take care of yourself." He said, "You too, Priya." She watched him walk to his car. The same unhurried walk, the same slight tilt of the shoulders she had noticed the first time she had ever seen him cross a room. He did not look back. Not because he was making a statement, but because he had, she understood, already grieved. He had been grieving for a long time, quietly, in the private space that his patience had always provided. And by the time they were standing on this pavement, he had already walked through most of it. She stood there for a moment after his car had gone. The street continued being a street. The trees continued being unreasonably beautiful. She thought about the garden, the one she had planted and he had tended, and that was currently, she knew, overgrown at the edges and wild at the back near the fence. She thought about how she had never once asked him how he felt about maintaining it. She had assumed, because he did it without complaint, that he did not mind. She had made that assumption about a great many things. The thought was not a revelation. It arrived quietly, the way the most permanent things do, not with thunder, but with the patient, ordinary weight of what has always been true. She walked to her car. She drove home. The garden was waiting. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a long time before she went inside.